The Chiricahua Mountains rose like silent guardians beneath the orange evening sky, their rocky slopes painted by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the pine trees. The Apache camp buzzed with the tension of a negotiation that had lasted 3 days, where men with faces hardened by desert life debated in circles around crackling fires. Mahko, a respected warrior of 40 winters, watched with impassive eyes as Chato, the young woman's father, nervously pointed to the 3 bay horses grazing near the leather tents. The debt contracted in bone games at tribal gatherings had grown like an infected wound. And now the desperate man offered his own daughter as payment, his hands trembling as he spoke of his shame. Nascha stood beside a tent, decorated with protective symbols, her 17 years carrying a dignity that contrasted with the humiliation surrounding her. Her hair, black as night, fell in braids adorned with small turquoise beads, and her dress of worked deerskin with colored threads revealed the artisanal skills she had learned from her deceased mother. Her dark eyes showed no tears, but a profound resignation that spoke of a soul already accustomed to pain, for she had lost her mother the previous winter, and now watched her father surrender to the vices that consumed his honor. The desert night wind carried the aroma of sage and cedar, mixed with the acrid smell of sweat from the men deciding her fate as if she were a mare or worked leather. Mahko had arrived at the camp 3 days earlier, coming from the mountains where he led a small group of warriors, resisting the pressures of American soldiers. His reputation as strategist and healer preceded him, and many sought him when war wounds or spiritual ailments required treatment. He had not come seeking a wife, but rather to trade medicines and weapons with other Apache groups. Yet Chato's proposal had caught his attention not for the young woman's beauty, but for the need of someone who could assist him in his healing practices. His own horses were magnificent animals, captured in battles against the Mexicans, and represented wealth enough for any negotiation. But the proposed trade carried a moral weight that made him hesitate. The tribal elders watched the negotiation with somber expressions, whispering among themselves about the degradation of traditional customs and the corrupting influence of gambling that had arrived with white traders. The crescent moon emerged from behind the mountain peaks, illuminating the scene with silver light that danced on the rocks and created deep shadows between the tents. Chato continued to plead, his Apache pride shattered by the desperate need to settle the debt that threatened him with total dishonor before his people. His words echoed through the camp like the laments of a wounded animal, carrying the bitterness of a man who had lost everything that defined him as warrior and father. Nascha finally raised her eyes to meet Mahko's gaze through the dancing flames of the central fire. And in that silent moment, something indefinable passed between them. It was not love, nor even attraction, but a mutual recognition of souls that had known loss and solitude. She saw in his eyes not the lust of a man who had bought property, but the cautious curiosity of someone who recognized an inner strength he did not yet fully understand. Mahko, in turn, perceived in the young woman's erect posture and the way she maintained dignity even in the face of humiliation, a resistance that reminded him of desert plants that bloom in the most adverse conditions. The agreement was sealed with a solemn gesture of hands, but both knew that this exchange represented only the beginning of a journey whose destination remained as uncertain as the trails that wound through the mountains in the moonlight. The journey to Mahko's camp lasted 5 days through rocky canyons and valleys covered with sagebrush, where the silence between them stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Nascha rode a gentle mare several meters behind the warrior, observing how he read tracks in the ground and interpreted signs left by other Apache groups that had passed through the region. His skilled hands guided his horse with a naturalness that spoke of years lived in harmony with the harsh desert land, and she noticed how he frequently stopped to gather medicinal plants growing among the rocks, carefully storing them in small leather pouches. His knowledge of the healing properties of desert herbs revealed itself at each stop, from the silver leaves of chaparral to the fibrous roots of yucca that he unearthed with almost ritual reverence. During the cold nights around small fires, Mahko prepared teas with the collected plants, offering them to her without words, but with gestures that demonstrated unexpected courtesy. Nascha accepted the steaming drinks and perceived how they relieved the tension in her muscles and calmed the anxiety she had carried in her chest since the shameful negotiation. She began to understand that his knowledge of healing extended beyond herbs. encompassing a deep understanding of the connection between body and spirit that her own mother had tried to teach her before dying. The stars shone intensely in the clear desert sky, creating a canopy of light that transformed the arid landscape into something almost sacred. And she felt that each night brought her closer to a transformation she could not yet name. Mahko's camp was situated in a valley protected by rock formations that rose like natural walls, where springs of crystalline water flowed from cracks in the stone and fed small gardens of carefully cultivated medicinal plants. 3 other Apache families lived there, forming a small but cohesive community of people who had chosen to resist pressures to surrender to government reservations. The women received her with respectful but distant curiosity, observing how she dismounted from her horse and carried her few belongings in a leather bag decorated with geometric patterns. Large-eyed children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering among themselves about the new arrival who brought with her stories of shame and negotiation, but also a dignity that was impossible to ignore. Mahko led her to a smaller tent situated near his own dwelling, a space that had been prepared with soft furs and baskets woven with traditional patterns. Inside it, small ceramic jars contained dried herbs and healing ointments, and she realized that the place had been organized as a workspace for someone versed in healing arts. He had observed during the journey how she instinctively identified medicinal plants and demonstrated knowledge about their properties, skills she had learned from her mother, and that now seemed to awaken his genuine interest. For the first time since leaving her father's camp, Nascha felt that perhaps she had found a place where her abilities would be valued instead of simply tolerated. On that first night in her new home, she remained awake, listening to the sounds of the valley, the murmur of flowing water, the distant call of coyotes in the mountains, and Mahko's deep breathing in the neighboring tent. The almost full moon illuminated the leather walls of the tent, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced gently while she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She was not the wife chosen for love, nor the companion won through courtship, but a woman acquired in exchange for horses, a truth that hurt like a thorn embedded in her chest. However, there was something in the way Mahko treated her, not as property, but as a person whose knowledge and skills had their own value, that kindled a small flame of hope in her weary heart. The valley held ancient secrets in its rocks and springs, and she felt that perhaps she could find there not just refuge, but a new identity built upon her own strengths. The first weeks in the valley brought a routine that gradually replaced uncertainty with familiarity, while Nascha discovered that her new life demanded skills that exceeded traditional domestic tasks. Mahko led her through the medicinal plant gardens in the cool desert mornings, showing her how to recognize the exact moment of harvest for each species and explaining through gestures and few words the specific properties of each herb. She watched fascinated as he prepared poultices for wounds, tinctures for internal pain, and herbal mixtures that strengthened the spirit when sadness threatened to consume the soul. Her own knowledge, acquired through her mother's lessons, expanded under his guidance, and she began to understand that she had been brought not just as a wife, but as apprentice and collaborator in work that transcended the boundaries of a common marriage. The valley inhabitants began seeking them when illnesses or injuries arose, and Nascha discovered that her hands had a natural gift for calming pain and accelerating healing. A feverish child was brought by his desperate mother during a stormy dawn, and she worked alongside Mahko through the night, applying cold compresses and administering teas that gradually lowered the boy's temperature. When the little one opened his eyes at sunrise and smiled weakly, she felt a deep satisfaction she had never experienced in the routine tasks of her previous life. Mahko observed her work with growing approval, noticing how she instinctively knew when to be gentle and when to be firm, when to speak words of comfort and when to allow healing silence to fill the space between them. The transformation of their relationship happened in subtle layers, like the almost imperceptible changes that mark the transition between desert seasons. They began working in natural harmony, she preparing mixtures while he diagnosed ailments, their movements synchronizing as if they had collaborated for years instead of weeks. During meals shared around small fires, Mahko began sharing stories of his time as a young warrior, speaking about battles against Mexican soldiers and about the wisdom of elders who taught him the secrets of healing. Nascha, in turn, described the weaving and embroidery techniques she had learned from her mother, but also gradually revealed knowledge about plants she had accumulated during long solitary walks through the mountains of her childhood. One afternoon, while organizing medicine jars in the healing tent, their fingers accidentally touched when they reached for the same ceramic container. The contact lasted only a moment, but both felt a current of recognition that surprised them with its intensity. Mahko slowly withdrew his hand, but his gaze remained fixed on her face, noticing for the first time how sunlight filtered through the tent walls created golden reflections in her dark eyes. Nascha felt her heart accelerate, not from the fear that had dominated her first days there, but from a genuine attraction that grew like a resilient plant finding fertile soil. They continued working in silence, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere between them. A mutual awareness that transformed each casual gesture into something charged with meaning. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Mahko approached her tent and asked permission to enter. She consented with a nod, and he sat respectfully near the entrance, the flames from the external fire creating a halo of light around his figure. He then spoke about the true reason he had accepted the trade proposed by her father, not from need of a wife, but because he had seen in her a spark of healing knowledge he had instantly recognized. His words carried an honesty that touched her deeply, revealing that she was not just acquired property, but a person whose abilities and presence had been genuinely desired. When he rose to leave, she gently held his arm, and in the look they exchanged, both recognized that something precious was blooming between them, something that transcended the unworthy circumstances of their first meeting and promised to transform into something deeper and truer. Winter came to the valley like a severe but expected visitor, bringing snowstorms that transformed the mountains into towers of crystalline ice and forced the community to gather around larger fires during the long, dark nights. Nascha and Mahko discovered that the proximity imposed by cold intensified the connection that had blossomed between them during the previous months, and their nightly conversations extended for hours while they prepared remedies for typical seasonal ailments. She had learned to read the signs in his face that indicated concern for some patient, and he began to value her suggestions about treatments, recognizing that her intuition frequently complemented his technical knowledge in surprising ways. The healing tent had become a refuge where both found not only shared purpose, but also an emotional intimacy that grew with each day they spent working side by side. A particularly violent storm brought to the valley a group of wounded Apache who had faced an American soldier patrol near the Mexican border. Among the wounded was a young warrior named Nascha, whose arm, pierced by a musket ball, had developed a serious infection that threatened his life. Mahko worked tirelessly to clean the wound and apply anti-inflammatory herb poultices, but it was Nascha who perceived that the young man's high fever did not respond to conventional treatments. She suggested a combination of plants her mother had used in similar cases, a mixture considered dangerous by some healers, but which could be the only chance to save the youth. Mahko hesitated only a moment before trusting completely in her judgment, and together they prepared the risky remedy while the warrior's life hung by a thread. For 3 days and 3 nights, they took turns caring for Nascha, applying cold compresses when fever rose and warming him when violent chills shook his thin body. Nascha remained beside the patient during the most critical hours, humming softly healing songs she had learned in childhood and observing every change in his breathing. Mahko watched her work with a dedication that revealed not just technical skill, but genuine compassion that transformed the act of healing into something almost sacred. When finally the fever broke and the young man opened his eyes with restored mental clarity, both felt a deep satisfaction that united them in a partnership that transcended any conventional matrimonial agreement. Nascha's recovery became cause for celebration in the community, and for the first time since her arrival, Nascha was recognized not as the woman who had been traded for horses, but as a healer respected in her own right. The other women of the valley began seeking her for advice about feminine ailments and childcare, and she discovered that her personal experiences of loss and abandonment gave her special understanding of others' suffering. Mahko watched proudly as she flourished in her new role, noting how her confidence grew with each person she helped, and how her presence brought a dimension of maternal care to the healing work he had performed for years in a more distant and technical manner. On a particularly cold night, when wind howled between the rocks and made the tent walls tremble, Mahko appeared at her tent entrance carrying extra furs and wood to stoke the fire. For the first time, he did not ask permission to enter, and she did not hesitate to make room for him beside the internal fire. They spent the night talking about the patients they had treated and the knowledge they had discovered together, but gradually the conversation drifted to personal memories and dreams for the future. When he extended his hand to touch her face and she did not pull away, both recognized that what had begun as a commercial transaction had transformed into something genuine and precious. The kiss they shared was gentle, but charged with all the respect and admiration they had developed for each other, sealing a union that had not been imposed by negotiation, but freely chosen by two hearts that had found in themselves perfect complementarity. Spring brought to the valley a renewal reflected not only in the awakening of medicinal plants, but also in the profound transformation that had occurred in the relationship between Nascha and Mahko. They had become true life companions, sharing not only the physical intimacy that had naturally bloomed between them, but also a spiritual and professional partnership that mutually strengthened them. Her tent had been joined to his through a covered passage, creating a larger space where they could work on their remedies and receive patients who arrived from distant camps seeking healing. Their complementary skills had developed to the point of functioning as a single mind divided into two bodies, she anticipating his needs, while he trusted completely in her intuitions about complex treatments. The news that Nascha was expecting a child came during a golden morning in late spring, confirmed by signs she herself had learned to recognize through her knowledge of the female body. Mahko received the revelation with silent but deep joy, gently touching her still flat belly and whispering words of gratitude to ancestral spirits who had blessed their union. She saw in his eyes not just the satisfaction of a man who would have an heir, but the genuine love of a companion who celebrated the creation of new life with the woman he had chosen to share his existence. Preparations for the child's arrival became a joint project, with him building a carved wooden cradle and her weaving blankets with patterns that would invoke protection and strength for the baby growing in her womb. During the months of pregnancy, Nascha discovered that her sensitivity for detecting diseases and imbalances had intensified, as if the new life she carried had amplified her capacity to perceive others' healing needs. Patients arriving at the valley commented on how she seemed to know exactly where their pain was located before they even described symptoms, and how her presence alone brought relief that prepared the ground for treatments that would follow. Mahko watched amazed as pregnancy had awakened in her healing powers that surpassed technical knowledge, manifesting as an almost supernatural intuition that made him question whether she had been born to be more than a simple healer. An event that would deeply test their abilities came in the form of a dysentery epidemic that struck an Apache camp located 2 days a journey from the valley. Desperate messengers arrived begging for help, describing how dozens of people, mainly children and elders, were dying from a disease their own healers could not contain. Mahko immediately prepared for the journey, but Nascha, already 6 months pregnant, insisted on accompanying him despite the evident risks. She argued that her knowledge about intestinal ailments and fevers could be crucial for saving lives, and that the child she carried in her womb would be protected by the same spirits that guided her in healing work. After long discussion, he yielded to her determination, recognizing that trying to leave her behind would be not only useless, but also deprive the sick of care that could mean the difference between life and death. The journey to the infected camp was slow and careful, with frequent stops so Nascha could rest, and so both could collect specific medicinal plants they would need in large quantities. During the journey, they planned treatment strategies and discussed how to organize a field hospital that could simultaneously serve dozens of patients. She suggested separating the sick by disease stages and creating quarantine areas to prevent new infections, demonstrating an understanding about contagion that surprised even Mahko. When they finally reached the devastated camp, they found a scene of despair that would test not only their medical skills, but also their emotional resistance in the face of human suffering in its rawest form. The work awaiting them would require everything they had learned together, and Nascha felt that this moment would define not only the fate of the sick, but also the legacy they would leave as healers united by love and the mission to alleviate their people's suffering. The camp struck by the epidemic presented a vision of devastation that would forever mark both their memories, with silent tents sheltering the dead and others, where moans of pain echoed day and night. Nascha and Mahko immediately organized a triage system, identifying the most serious cases requiring immediate attention and those who could still be saved with adequate treatment. She worked tirelessly preparing large quantities of astringent herb teas and rehydration solutions, her hands swollen from pregnancy, moving with precision even when exhaustion threatened to bring her down. The weight of the child in her womb made each movement more difficult, but she refused to slow the pace while lives depended on her care, and Mahko alternated between caring for patients and protecting his companion from efforts that could harm both her and the baby. For 5 days and 5 nights, they fought against the disease that had decimated entire families, applying all knowledge they possessed about medicinal plants and traditional healing techniques. Nascha developed a special mixture of red oak bark and echinacea roots that proved particularly effective against severe dysentery, saving several children who had already been given up for dead by other healers. Her reputation as a healer spread to neighboring camps, and even amid tragedy, stories about the pregnant young woman who healed with her hands began circulating among Apache tribes. Mahko watched with admiration and growing concern as she gave herself completely to the work, ignoring her own need for rest to remain beside each critical patient until danger passed. The turning point in the battle against the epidemic came when Nascha discovered that many of the most serious cases were related to contamination of the camp's main water source. Using purification knowledge she had learned from her mother, she guided the community to boil all water and add certain herbs with antibacterial properties before consumption. At the same time, she and Mahko worked to create a new clean water source, diverting a nearby stream and building natural filters with sand and charcoal. The combination of intensive medical treatment and prevention of new infections finally began showing results, with the number of new cases decreasing drastically and recovering patients beginning to show signs of vitality again. However, the intense effort had taken its toll on Nascha's body, who began feeling premature contractions during the 4th night at the infected camp. Mahko, perceiving signs of premature labor, had to make the most difficult decision of his life: abandon patients still recovering to care for the woman he loved and the child they both eagerly awaited. He carried her to an isolated tent and quickly prepared necessary remedies to try stopping premature labor, his skilled hands trembling for the first time since becoming a healer. Nascha, even amid pain and fear, continued giving instructions about care for patients they had left behind, demonstrating a dedication that deeply touched all who witnessed her courage. The contractions finally ceased after hours of intensive treatment with herbs that relaxed the uterus and breathing techniques she herself had developed, but both knew the experience had been a grave warning about the limits of her physical resistance. Mahko made the decision to return immediately to the valley, carrying Nascha on an improvised stretcher and leaving detailed instructions for local healers to continue treating remaining patients. During the return journey, he remained constantly vigilant about her condition, stopping frequently to check for signs of new contractions and administering calming teas that helped keep the pregnancy stable. She rested in his arms with satisfaction, knowing they had saved dozens of lives, but also with awareness that they had almost lost the child who represented the future of their love and their union as healers, dedicated to their people's well-being. The return to the valley brought a period of forced recovery for Nascha, who spent the following weeks under the attentive care of Mahko and the other community women who had developed deep admiration for her courage and dedication. She remained in the tent during most of the day, weaving blankets for the baby and preparing simpler remedies that did not require intense physical effort. But her mind remained active, planning improvements to their healing techniques and mentally documenting lessons learned during the epidemic. Mahko had become even more protective, refusing to answer calls that would take him far from the valley, and limiting his treatments to cases that could be resolved without putting Nascha under pressure to help. The near-fatal experience had transformed his perspective on the balance between their mission as healers and their responsibility as future parents, teaching them that even the most dedicated healers needed to recognize their human limitations. During the 8th month of pregnancy, special visitors arrived at the valley, the parents of children who had been saved during the epidemic, bringing gifts and offering services as gratitude for their children's lives. A particularly respected elder, whose grandson had been given up by other healers before being cured by Nascha, presented her with a necklace of sacred beads that had belonged to her own grandmother, a legendary healer among the Apache. The gift ceremony transformed into a spontaneous celebration of life and healing, with stories being told about miracles witnessed during the dark days of the epidemic. Nascha listened with growing emotion as her reputation had spread among tribes, being described not just as a skilled healer, but as a woman whose spirit of sacrifice had deeply touched all who knew her. The birth of their daughter happened during a full moon night, when the valley was bathed in silver light that transformed the mountains into luminous guardians. Mahko assisted the birth with experienced hands, but the heart of a father for the first time, alternating between his identity as technical healer and the emotional vulnerability of a man witnessing his first daughter's arrival. Nascha demonstrated the same courage she had shown facing the epidemic, working with her body through contractions with serene determination that inspired all present. When the child finally emerged into the world with a strong cry that echoed through the tent walls, both instantly knew she carried within herself the spiritual strength of both parents, a combination of healing power that would manifest in still unknown ways. The girl was named Itzel, meaning moon star, in honor of her birth circumstances and the light that seemed to radiate from her dark eyes from the first moments of life. The community women declared they had never seen a baby born with such vitality and presence, observing how she seemed to respond to healing sounds and healers, presence with uncommon attention for such a new child. Mahko held his daughter with reverence that revealed not only paternal love, but also recognition that he had been blessed with a child destined to continue the healer lineage he and Nascha had established. The entire valley celebrated the birth with traditional songs and offerings to sacred springs, recognizing that this child represented renewal and hope for future Apache generations. The months following the birth brought a new dimension to the partnership between Nascha and Mahko, who discovered how to integrate maternal care with their continued work as healers. Itzel seemed to flourish in the healing atmosphere that permeated their home, sleeping peacefully during treatments and demonstrating remarkable calm, even when patients arrived in states of intense suffering. Nascha developed techniques for carrying the baby while working, creating a kind of mobile cradle that allowed her to nurse and care for her daughter without completely interrupting her healing activities. The child's presence in the healing tent seemed to have a calming effect on patients, who frequently commented on how they felt more hopeful and confident in recovery when seeing the small family working together. Nascha's transformation from woman traded for horses to respected matriarch of a healer lineage was completed during a special ceremony organized by the valley elders. They formally recognized her not just as Mahko's wife, but as a healer in her own right, whose contributions to the healing arts had elevated the entire community's status. The sacred necklace she had received from the grateful elder was officially blessed by ancestral spirits, transforming into a symbol of her spiritual authority that would eventually be transmitted to her daughter. Mahko watched the ceremony with deep pride, recognizing that the woman beside him had become much more than he could ever have imagined when he first saw her at her father's camp. The journey that had begun with humiliation and commercial transaction had blossomed into a story of love, purpose, and legacy that would be told by future Apache generations as an example of how destiny can transform even the most difficult circumstances into unexpected blessings. The years that followed brought to the valley an era of prosperity and recognition that extended far beyond the Chiricahua Mountains, with healers from distant tribes making pilgrimages to learn from Nascha and Mahko the secrets of their healing art. Itzel grew as an exceptional child, demonstrating from very early a natural affinity with medicinal plants, and an intuitive capacity to detect diseases that surprised even her experienced parents. At 5 years old, she already knew how to identify dozens of different herbs and had begun helping prepare simple remedies, her small hands working with precision that suggested she had inherited not only knowledge, but also the natural gift for healing. The valley had transformed into an informal learning center where young Apache came to study techniques developed by the couple and where entire families found not only medical treatment, but also spiritual renewal. Nascha's reputation as the woman who heals with spirit had spread even among traditionally hostile tribes, and stories about her deeds during the epidemic had transformed into legends that inspired other women to develop their own healing gifts. She had established an informal school for young women, teaching not only medicinal plant properties, but also the importance of combining technical knowledge with genuine compassion and spiritual intuition. Mahko watched with admiration as she had become a natural leader, capable of inspiring confidence and devotion not through imposed authority, but through the example of her own tireless dedication to others' well-being. Together, they had created a legacy that transcended their own lives, establishing healing traditions that would be transmitted through future generations. A final test of their abilities and union came when Chato himself, the father who had traded Nascha for horses, appeared at the valley after years of absence, sick and humiliated by the consequences of his vices. He had lost everything: social position, properties, and tribal respect, and arrived as a beggar imploring forgiveness and healing for a disease that was slowly consuming his body and spirit. Nascha faced deep emotional conflict, seeing the man who had caused her greatest humiliation. But her compassionate nature and the values she had developed as a healer prevented her from refusing help to any suffering person. Mahko supported her decision to treat her father, recognizing that this moment represented a healing opportunity that extended beyond the physical, encompassing emotional and spiritual wounds that had remained open for years. Chato's treatment became not just a medical matter, but a family reconciliation process that required from Nascha an inner strength she did not know she possessed. For weeks, she cared for her father with the same dedication she offered any patient ached, administering remedies for his physical disease, while gradually allowing hesitant conversations to begin healing wounds from the past. Chato, in turn, was daily confronted with evidence of how his daughter had flourished despite the shame he had caused, and how she had built a life of purpose and dignity that brutally contrasted with his own moral downfall. The presence of Itzel, his granddaughter whom he was meeting for the first time, served as a constant reminder of the future that was still possible even after the gravest past mistakes. Chato's healing was gradual but complete, encompassing not only recovery of his physical health, but also a spiritual transformation that led him to dedicate his final years to serving the community he had dishonored. He became a humble assistant in the healing tent, performing simple but essential tasks that allowed Nascha and Mahko to focus on more complex aspects of healing. In his daughter and son-in-law's presence, he rediscovered values he had abandoned, and his silent gratitude expressed itself through total dedication to the work they performed. When he finally died, years later, it was as a redeemed man, surrounded by the family he had almost lost forever, and by the community that had learned to respect him again. Nascha mourned his death, not as the daughter who had been traded for horses, but as a healer who had witnessed the transformative power of forgiveness and second chances, thus completing a journey that had begun in the deepest humiliation and culminated in the most complete redemption possible. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.